Hi, Grandma here, and we're reading The Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Speare. In the previous chapters, Etienne showed Matt how to make a bow, and he also and it apparently was a very good bow, and Matt has been practicing with it. They also exchanged big flood stories. They finished up Robinson Crusoe, so Matt decided to go to the Bible and start telling stories that are from the Bible. And the first one he chose was Noah. Beginning chapter 15. On the day of their greatest adventure, Etienne had come without his dog, so there was no warning. Matt was in fine spirits that day because he'd managed, by a magnificent stroke of luck, to hit a rabbit with his bow and arrow. It was the first time this had happened, and it was more the rabbit's doing than his own. The silly creature just sat there and let him take careful aim. All the same, he was pleased with himself, and even more pleased that Etienne had been there to see it. When the boys decided to leave the beaver dam again, Matt was unwilling to leave the rabbit behind in case some thieving animal should discover it. He was walking behind Etienne, swinging the rabbit carelessly by the ears, as Etienne always does, when the Indian suddenly halted. His whole body tensed. Matt could see nothing unusual, and he had opened his mouth to speak when Etienne silenced him with a jerk of his hand. Then he heard a sound in the underneath brush ahead. Now, not a rustle like a grouse or a snake. Not a trapped animal. This was a stirring of something moving slowly and heavily. He felt a cold prickle in his stomach. He stood beside Etienne, his own muscles tight, scarcely breathing. A low bush bent sideways. Through the leaves, a brown head thrust itself, bigger than that of a dog and shaggier. It was a small bear cub. Matt could see the little eyes peering at them curiously, the brown nose wrinkling at the strange smell of human boy. The little animal looked so comical that Matt almost laughed out loud. Etienne warned under his breath. There was a crashing of bush and a low snarling growl. An immense paw reached through the thicket and tumbled the cub over and out of sight. In its place loomed a huge brown shape. Bursting through the leaves was a head 3 times as big as the cub's. No curiosity in those small eyes, only an angry reddish gleam. Somehow Matt had the sense not to run. He stood frozen on the path. A bear could overtake a running man in a few bounds, and this one was only 2 bounds away. The bear's head moved slowly from side to side. Its heavy body brushed aside the branches as though they were cobwebs. Slowly it rose on its hind legs. Matt could see the wicked curving of claws. Matt would never know why he acted as he did. He could not remember thinking at all, only staring with numb horror as the creature was about to charge. Somehow he did move. He swung the dead rabbit by its ears and hurled it straight to the bear's head. The tiny body struck the bear squarely on its nose. With a jerk of her head, the bear shook it off as though it were a buzzing mosquito. The rabbit flopped useless to the ground. The bear did not even bother to look down at it. She'd been distracted for only an instant, but in that instant, something flashed through the air. There was a sharp twang and a dull thud of a bow. Just between the eyes of the bear, the shaft of Etienne's arrow quivered. As the waving fork paws began to lower, a second arrow struck just below the bear's shoulder. The great head shuddered and sank toward the ground. With a wild yell, Etienne sprang forward and thrust his knife deep, just below the first arrow. Still scarcely aware that he moved at all, Matt leaped after him. Jerking his own knife from his belt, he sank it into the brown fur. His blow had been misplaced, but it was not needed. The bear's sides were heaving. The boys stood watching. In a few minutes it lay still. Matt stared down at the creature in horror. The fearsome yellow teeth were still bared in a snarl. Saliva and blood dribbled down from the open jaws. The little eyes that had glittered so savagely were filmed over. The long, sharp claws hung powerless, clotted with pawed-up earth. Now there was nothing to fear. Matt felt his knees shaking. He hoped that Etienne would not notice, and he managed a wide grin to hide his trembling. But Etienne did not grin back. He stood over the bear, and he began to speak, slowly and solemnly, in his own tongue. He spoke for some time. "What were you saying?" Matt demanded when the speaking was over. "I tell bear I do not want to kill," Etienne answered. "Indian not kill she-bear with cub. I tell bear we did not come here to hunt." "But it might have killed us both." "Maybe. I asked bear to forgive that I must kill." "Well, I'm mighty thankful that you did," Matt said stoutly. He was about to say that he'd never been so scared in his life, but he thought better of it. Etienne looked at him, and his solemnness suddenly dissolved in a grin. "You move quick," he said, "like Indian." Matt felt his cheeks turn red. "You killed him," he said honestly. Yet he knew that he had had a part. He had given Etienne just that instant in which to notch his arrow. Etienne nudged the bear with his toe. "Small," he said, "just some fat, good for eat." Small? That monstrous creature, it seemed, was too big for two boys to carry. It appeared that Etienne had no intention of trying. "Belong squaw now," he said. "I go tell." "You mean a squaw is going to carry that heavy thing?" "Cut up meat and then carry. Squaw work," Etienne answered. It was plain that he had done the man's work and was finished with it. The cub, Matt remembered now. It was nowhere in sight. Etienne shook his head. "Let cub go," he said. "When Sigwan come again, him plenty big to eat." "Take rabbit," Etienne reminded him. Matt looked with distaste at the rabbit, almost covered by the bear's heavy paw, the fur matted and bloody. He would rather not have touched it, but obediently he pulled it out. It was his dinner, after all, and he knew that in Etienne's world, everything that was killed must be used. The Indians did not kill in sport. When Etienne had disappeared into the forest, Matt still stood looking down at the first bear he had ever seen. He felt resentful. Etienne had killed the bear, of course. It was his by right, but Matt would have liked just a share of that meat, or even one of those big claws to show his father. Then he remembered the Indian boy's tribute. He had moved fast, like an Indian. That would be enough to share. Chapter 16. Well, now we know what the picture is on the cover. In the late afternoon, Matt sat in the cabin doorway. He couldn't think of any work to do. He felt restless, the excitement still jumping about inside him. He needed to talk with someone. He wanted to tell his father about the bear. Thinking of his father, he felt that snake of worry crawling about behind every other thought. That worry was becoming more frequent every day. What could have kept his father so long? Suppose some accident had befallen him. The meeting with the bear had shaken Matt's trust in the forest. Now it seemed to close him in on every side, dark and threatening. Suppose his father had met with a bear. Suppose he had never got back to Quincy. How would his mother know where to find this place, or even where to send anyone to look for him? Matt hugged his arms around his chest, but the cold was inside. It would not go away. Something moved at the edge of the woods. Matt leaped to his feet. A stranger came walking into the clearing. With an ugly chill against his backbone, Matt stared at the hideously painted face. Then he recognized Etienne, a very different Etienne from the boy who had walked with him in the forest that morning. The Indian boy had washed his body, and it shone with fresh grease. He'd combed his tangled black locks. Down his cheeks on either side and on his forehead ran broad streaks of blue and white paint. On a cord around his neck dangled a row of new bear's claws. In case Etienne had noticed his first alarm, Matt greeted him boldly. "What's the war paint for?" he demanded. "Not war paint," Etienne answered. "Squaws make feast with bear. My grandfathers say you come." Matt hesitated, unable to believe his ears. It took him a moment to realize this was actually an invitation. "Thanks," he stammered. "I'm sure I'd like some of that bear meat. Wait till I get my jacket." "Shut door," Etienne reminded him. "Maybe another bear come." Etienne was in good humor. He had made one of his unexpected jokes. "Long way," Etienne said after a time. Matt was certain they must have been walking fast for more than an hour. He remembered that Etienne had already walked all this way to fetch him, and he kept silent. It was so dark now that he could barely see to put one foot before the other, but he realized that they were on a well-beaten trail. Just as the last light was glinting above the treetops, they reached a riverbank. Drawn up at its edge was a small birch canoe. Etienne motioned him to step into it. Then he gave a push and leaped nimbly into the stern. His paddle moved soundlessly. Grateful to sit still, Matt was entranced by the speed, the silence, the gliding shadows on the silver river. He was regretful that in a few strokes they'd reached the other side. Now Matt could see a glimmer of light deep in the woods. Etienne led him toward it, and presently their way was barred by a solid wall of upright posts, a stockade. For the first time, a quiver of uneasiness made Matt falter. But stronger than any doubt, curiosity drove him on. Not for one moment would he have turned back. Eagerly, he followed Etienne through a gateway into an open space filled with smoke and moving shadows and wavering patches of light cast by birch bark torches. All around him in a circle rose the dim shapes of cabins and cone-shaped wigwams. In the center of the circle, a long, narrow fire was burning between walls of logs. Suspended on timbers hung 3 iron pots, sending up rosy curls of steam in the smoky air. The fragrance of boiling meat and pungent herbs made Matt's stomach crawl. Then he was aware of the Indians. They sat silently on either side of the fire, their painted faces ghastly in the flickering light. They were clad in an odd medley of garments, some in Englishmen's coats and jackets, others with bright blankets draping their shoulders. A few had feathers standing straight up from headbands. Everywhere there was the gleam of metal on arms and chests. Women in bright cloth skirts and odd pointed caps moved about without a sound, adding wood to the fire or stirring the contents of the kettles. Light glinted on their silver armbands and necklaces. Clearly, the Indians had put on their finest array for this feast. It came over Matt with a rush of shame how very shabby he must look in their eyes. Even if Etienne had warned him, what could he have done? He had no other clothes to wear. Probably Etienne had known that and so had said nothing. No one seemed to notice him, yet he was conscious of the unblinking stares of the row facing him. The others did not turn their heads. They seemed to be waiting. In silence, Matt's heart beat so loudly they all surely must have heard it. After a long pause, one man rose slowly and came toward him. It was Saknus, his paint-streaked face barely recognizable. He wore a long red coat decorated by a handsome beaded collar and metal armbands. A crown of feathers rose from his beaded band around his forehead. He stood very tall, and there was pride in his stern features. Why, Matt thought, he looked like a king. "Kwe," Saknus said with dignity. "White boy, welcome." In a sudden, terrifying yell, the rows of Indians echoed this greeting. "Tahoe!" they shouted. "Tahoe! Ye bye-bye?" "Quay," Matt stammered in return, then more boldly, "Quay." The Indians seemed satisfied. Smiles flashed in their dark faces. There was rough laughter, and then, seeming to forget him, they began to jabber to each other. From nowhere, children suddenly crowded around him, giggling, daring each other to touch him. Matt's heart slowed its pounding. There was nothing to fear in this place, but after the weeks of stillness in his cabin, the noise was confusing. He was grateful when Etienne came to his rescue and led him to a seat at the end of a log. An old woman approached and held out to him a gourd cup. It contained a sweetish drink, acid and flavored with maple sugar, good on his dry tongue. Saknus raised his arm, and instantly the clamor was silenced. There was no doubt Etienne's grandfather was the leader here. An Indian brought him a long pipe, and Saknus put it to his lips and slowly blew out a long wreath of smoke. The rows of Indians waited respectfully for him to speak. Instead, the old man turned to his grandson and held out the pipe. Etienne stepped into the center of the clearing. In the firelight, he stood straight and slender, his bare arms and legs gleaming. Matt had never seen him like this. Proudly, he took the pipe and set it briefly to his own lips and handed it back to his grandfather. Then he began to speak. Matt did not need to understand the words. He soon realized that Etienne was recounting the morning's adventure. Watching his gestures, Matt felt himself living again the walk through the woods, the meeting with the small cub, the fearsome mother about to charge. As Etienne spoke, the Indians urged the boy on with grunts and shouts of approval and pleasure. Etienne tensed his body. He uttered a sharp cry, pointed at Matt, and made a flinging sweep of his arm, hurled an imaginary rabbit. The seated figures broke into loud cries, shouting, "Hey!" grinning and pointing at Matt, swinging their own arms in imitation. Matt's cheeks were hot. He knew they were making fun of him. But boisterous as it was, the sound was friendly. Now they turned back to Etienne and followed his story with growing excitement. Etienne certainly made a very good story of it. His telling took a lot longer than the actual event. Plainly, they all enjoyed it, and in listening, they were all taking part in it. Etienne was a skillful storyteller. Matt could understand now just how he must have delighted them with his acting out of Robinson Crusoe. When the narrative was over, the Indians sprang to their feet. They formed a long line. Then began a sound that sent a tingle, half dread, half pleasure, down Matt's spine. A lone Indian had leaped to the head of the line, beating a rattle against his palm in an odd, stirring rhythm. He strutted and pranced in ridiculous contortions, for all the world like a clown in a village fair. The line of figures followed after him, aping him and stamping their feet in response. Etienne was at his side again. "Dance now," he said, "then feast." The rhythm of the rattle quickened. The line of figures wove round the fire faster and faster. Women joined now at the end of the line, linking their arms, swaying. Finally, the children, even small children, were dancing, stamping their small naked feet. "Dance," Etienne commanded. He seized Matt's arm and pulled him into the moving line. The men near him cheered him on, laughing at Matt's stumbling attempts. Once he caught his breath, Matt found it simple to follow the step. His confidence swelled as the rhythm throbbed through his body, loosening his tight muscles. He was suddenly filled with excitement and happiness. His own heels pounded against the hard ground. He was one of them. He came back to earth with a stitch in his side. His legs threatened to give way underneath him. The dancing seemed to have no end. Determined that Etienne should not see him weakening, he moved faster and stamped harder. Finally, when he felt he could not make the circle one more time, the dance ended. The feasting began. A squaw brought him a wood bowl filled with thick hot stew and a curiously carved wooden spoon. The first steaming mouthful burned his tongue, but he was too hungry to wait. He thought nothing had ever tasted so good, dark and greasy and spicy. So this was bear meat. Presently he noticed that Etienne sat beside him, eating nothing. "You're not eating," he said with a sudden doubt. "Have you given me your share?" "This is my bear," the boy answered. "I kill, not eat. Maybe not get any more bear." He didn't sound as if he minded in the least, as if, in fact, he was proud of not eating. When Matt's bowl was empty, the squaw refilled it. By the time he finished, sleepiness began to drag at his eyelids. He could barely hold them open. Etienne seemed in no hurry to leave. The Indians were enjoying themselves, refilling their bowls, shouting at each other, laughing and slapping their legs at what seemed to be uproarious jokes. This was noisier than any celebration Matt had ever seen in Quincy, even on Muster Day. Why had he ever had the idea that the Indians were a dull lot? At last, however, they fell silent, and Matt saw that one of them was beginning another story. It promised to be a long one. Between the sentences, the speaker drew on his pipe, and the smoke curled from his nose and mouth as he spoke. Matt's head drooped and came up with a painful jerk. He'd almost fallen asleep sitting up. Etienne laughed and motioned him to his feet. At the thought of tramping all the way back to the cabin, Matt groaned. It must be close to midnight. Then he saw that Etienne did not mean to go back. He led Matt toward one of the wigwams and pulled back the flap of deerskin that hung across the door. Inside, a small fire burned, and by its faint light, Matt saw a low platform covered with matting and fur. Etienne made a silent motion, and Matt, too sleepy to question, gratefully let his tired body sink down on the soft skins. Etienne stirred up the fire and left him alone. Once, long after, Matt roused to hear the rattle and the pounding of feet. The Indians were dancing again, and he was thankful to stay right where he was. Well, that was certainly interesting, and we found out why the picture on the front. And if you look carefully by the trees, you see the Indian with a bow and arrow, and you see a boy here who looks like he's throwing something. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. See you later.